The early months of 1942 didn't go well for the Allies. With British and resistance forces tied up in Europe by the Nazi war machine, it left Japan to spread the cloak of imperialism over most of Southeast Asia, granting them dominance in the Pacific. However, as their oil supplies dwindled, the Empire of the Rising Sun had struck out at their once main suppliers, the United States. While the initial raid on Pearl Harbor had taken the sleeping giant by surprise, it was an action that would eventually bring about the end of the war in this theatre, as the US began to bring to bear their own resistance to the Japanese across many Indonesian battlegrounds, before eventually taking the fight to the shores of Imperial Japan. However, this was still a long way off. Dominance on the sea had to be reacquired after much of the proud American fleet was decimated in the sneak attack at Hawaii. Fortunately for the Allies, though, 3 of their main aircraft carriers had been elsewhere, and they would eventually prove instrumental in turning the tide in the Pacific. As these were readied for the eventual counterattack, other US forces battled Japanese troops across the many islands of the Philippines, often losing. Allied naval forces in the area had been destroyed in a series of battles around Java, and with almost all neighbouring territories under Japanese control, the troops were now cut off from most of their supplies and surrounded by the enemy. This left Allied defences weakened and meant that when the full scale of the assault was brought against them, there was little they could do. Suffering from sickness, malnutrition and combat fatigue, they were too weak to counterattack effectively, forcing their surrender. Some men did make an escape to the Corregidor Island in the south of Bataan, but they were swiftly pushed back by the Japanese troops who forced them to the Malinta Hill. It wasn't long before the American flag was lowered, and General Jonathan Wainwright, commander in the area, accepted the surrender terms of General Masaharu. The Philippine Islands officially fell to the Empire of the Rising Sun on the 8th of May 1942. Another tragedy on a much grander scale was soon to follow, though, as with 80,000 Allied prisoners, the Japanese had to arrange transportation to prison camps. Imperial commanders decided to march the men over 60 miles to a railhead at San Fernando. This trek was soon to be known as the Bataan Death March, as it proved to be a terrible ordeal, especially for those malnourished or injured. Many thousands died along the way as a result of exhaustion, hunger, sickness and dehydration. On top of this, their captors, who saw surrender as an embarrassment, murdered many of them indiscriminately. Being relative newcomers to the Second World War, the American public and military were unprepared for the barbarism exacted by the Japanese during this march. However, while the suffering of the prisoners was horrendous, it galvanized the US into action. They had already decided that a counterattack against their eastern enemies was necessary. The question was how to do it. The problem now wasn't a moral one, but a logistical and engineering issue. Imperial Japan was almost 4,000 nautical miles from the naval base at Pearl Harbor, far too great a distance for Allied planes to make any sort of aerial raid. Despite this fact, though, this is exactly what the US military endeavoured to do. With such an ambitious project in mind, Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle, one of the most famous aviators and aeronautical engineers in America, had been chosen to plan and execute the attack. Over the years, Doolittle had won an array of awards for his achievements and had made many important contributions to aviation technology. But the task that lay ahead would be one of his greatest challenges yet. The main problem he faced was that America had no bases within bomber operating range of Tokyo, and although an attack could be launched from aircraft carriers, planes which were typically used with these ships would not be able to cause a great deal of damage. After long deliberation, an idea was eventually conceived to adapt giant B-25 bombers so they were light enough to take off from carrier decks. By the beginning of April, these highly modified planes were aboard the USS Hornet and on their way to the Pacific. Vice Admiral Mark Mitscher captained the carrier from which Doolittle would launch his attack, while the task force would be led into enemy waters and protected by Vice Admiral William Halsey aboard the USS Enterprise. Typical of many wartime plans, especially the stealth kind, not all end up going to plan. As the Hornet and Enterprise ventured close to Japanese waters, they were spotted by a Japanese picket boat. This created a real problem, as the carriers were incredibly vulnerable to attack from land-based aircraft. Taking the initiative, Halsey made the decision to launch the raid early, despite the increased risk of pilots not being able to make it to Allied territory after dropping their payload. The aircraft had less than 470 feet of runway, and none of the pilots, including Doolittle, had ever taken off from a carrier before. In fact, no one had ever attempted to launch a bomber the size of a B-25 from the deck of a carrier before, making the task a challenge to say the least. But the rigorous training the volunteer army crews had received had clearly paid off, and all 16 B-25s carrying their deadly payloads of incendiary bombs and high explosives were launched successfully. Although the Japanese alert meant the planes were now setting off 180 miles from their original launch site, favourable weather would help them along the way. The bombers would soon be closing in on their targets, with Doolittle's plane at the helm. Six hours after takeoff, the planes reached Tokyo, and at noon they began dropping bombs on the capital and the surrounding areas. They met with little resistance, and the impact made was exactly what Roosevelt had hoped for. The Japanese were so shocked by the attack that high-level military commanders began blaming each other, and the mortified commander of Tokyo's air defense was shamed into committing suicide. In the meantime, Japanese fighter squadrons were returned home, and a carrier group was withdrawn from the Indian Ocean to protect home waters. However, while the desired effect of the raid was achieved, the aftermath was not smooth sailing for those that took part in it. Due to the extreme range of the bombing run, even the lightened B-25s were unable to make the return trip to the carriers. Add to this the near 200-mile addition of the early launch, and staying airborne long enough to reach safe zones in Allied China became near impossible. While Doolittle and others did make it to safety after being helped by Chinese resistance fighters and military personnel, not all would be so lucky. 2 crews were imprisoned by the Japanese after landing in enemy territory. 3 of these men would eventually be executed. However, they weren't the only casualties in the days after the raid. Angered by the attack and the help found by American pilots, the Japanese launched a massive retaliation campaign right into the heart of the Chinese peasantry, killing over 250,000 villagers. Such vicious retribution revealed just how much the attack on Tokyo had injured Japanese pride. And although the damage to Japan itself was not as severe as Doolittle had hoped, the fact that US bombers had reached the homeland at all would have a profound effect on Japan's decision-making in the next step of their Pacific War. Ultimately, the attack surprised Japanese officers immensely, with the commander of Tokyo's air defense being shamed into committing suicide. Those left were charged with planning the next move for the empire. Two options became popular. One group favoured further raids into Australia, as they feared it would become an American military zone, allowing further attacks from their technologically equal rival. However, another opinion, championed by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, was more naval-oriented. He believed that the rapidly expanding empire needed to create a defence buffer against further attack, and that territory expansion wasn't strictly necessary at this time. Due to the new land they now held, Japan had a near limitless supply of resources to power their war machine. However, the supply routes between the occupied countries and their homeland needed to be protected. This wasn't the only thing to worry Yamamoto, though. The Japanese admiral was aware that the failure to destroy valuable carriers at Pearl Harbor had been a fatal mistake, and to ensure the survival of the empire and indeed of Japan itself, it was essential to finish what he'd started in December 1941 and complete the destruction of the American fleet. Yamamoto began to conceive a plan to lure US carriers within range of a Japanese task force for a monumental battle which would ensure Japanese control of the Central Pacific. He selected as his target Midway Atoll, two tiny coral islands which lay on the extreme northwest of the Hawaiian island chain. The American base here was far enough from Hawaii to lessen the risk of heavy land-based air power threatening Japanese ships. And not only would valuable US carriers be sent out to protect the atoll, if captured, Midway would further extend the Japanese defensive perimeter and even provide a useful base to launch attacks on the west coast of America. Yamamoto had, however, struggled to convince Admiral Nagano that an attack on Midway should take priority, and until April 18, 1942, preparations had been focused on advancing further south towards Australia rather than on destroying the American fleet. Despite Yamamoto's efforts, his plans were shelved, and the decision was made to not only attack Port Moresby, but to take over interim territories like the Solomon Islands in order to establish bases close to the continent for further advances. What the Japanese didn't realise, however, was that the Americans had cracked their codes, and as signal traffic was intercepted by US and British intelligence, Admiral Nimitz was informed of the imminent attack on Port Moresby. The news was treated very seriously by the American commander, who was aware that Australia would be left vulnerable if the Japanese established bases so close to the country. After consulting Admiral Ernest King, head of the US Navy, it was decided that the invasion should be opposed with all the aircraft carriers the Allied forces could muster. A fleet centred on two carrier groups was rapidly assembled and included Task Force 17, based around the carrier USS Yorktown, and Task Force 11, based around the carrier USS Lexington. Rear Admiral Frank Fletcher, who had already seen action in the Pacific after the Marshall and Gilbert Islands raid back in February, was placed in command of Yorktown and would also be in overall command of the mission. Meanwhile, Rear Admiral Aubrey Fitch would command Lexington, and there would also be a joint Australian-American cruiser force to provide additional support. Task Force 44 would be commanded by Rear Admiral John Crace of the Royal Navy. As the ships headed towards New Guinea and the Solomon Islands, they would encounter many dangers along the way, with high seas and heavy winds to combat. But there was no doubt that every man on board was willing to brave the worst of storms if it meant he was given the opportunity to strike back at the Japanese. US forces didn't have to wait long for their taste of action, as on May the 3rd, news arrived that the Japanese invasion force had arrived at the Solomon Islands. The attack was being headed by Rear Admiral Shima, with other Japanese commanders handling the Port Moresby invasion and the carrier force. While Japanese troops began to pour onto Tulagi, Fletcher altered course to head due north towards the enemy, and on May the 4th, 60 aircraft were launched in 3 waves from Yorktown, taking Shima's forces completely by surprise. The attack was a success, and as well as hitting 3 minesweepers and 4 seaplanes, the Americans managed to sink an important Japanese destroyer. Nevertheless, the Japanese would continue to hold Tulagi as they set to work establishing a seaplane base on the island. After inflicting a considerable amount of damage on the Japanese fleet, Fletcher took his task force due south to meet up with Crace and Fitch's ships. But now the Japanese were aware of the presence of American carriers in the area. Eager to accomplish what Yamamoto hoped to do at Midway, it was now Admiral Takagi's turn to take part in the action. He led his carrier strike force from its position, 350 miles north of the Solomon Islands, and entered the Coral Sea to hunt for the Allies. It was a journey into the unknown, as the scene was set for the first ever aircraft carrier battle in history. It would later be described by a US commander as one of the most confusing battle areas in world history, as Japanese and American forces played cat and mouse with what could be considered each side's most valuable naval assets. In the build-up to the main conflict, the commotion amongst pilots for both armies was obvious. Planes would fire on their own forces, and some even attempted to land on enemy carriers. However, on the 8th of May, the decisive battle was fought, as American and Japanese fleets spied each other almost simultaneously. All combat planes were scrambled. By 9:25, all aircraft had been launched, and as the carriers headed for each other, Yorktown Strike Force attacked at 11 a.m, to be met by 16 Japanese Zero fighters protecting the carrier Shokaku and her sister ship. While planes lunged and swooped through the air, avoiding anti-aircraft fire, Shokaku was hit by 2 1,000-pound bombs, which caused heavy damage to her flight deck, and before long, with further attacks from Lexington, she was out of the battle. But the Japanese soon struck back, and 14 planes swept in to attack USS Lexington in a pincer movement. She was hit twice by torpedoes before dive bombers moved in, hitting the ship again. Meanwhile, a bomb exploded on Yorktown's deck, but while Fletcher's carrier would survive another day, Lexington would not be so lucky. With a ruptured fuel tank, the carrier was doomed, and as a series of dramatic explosions detonated within the massive ship, over 2,500 men rushed to escape, with other Allied craft attempting to pull them to safety. Despite the Americans feeling that they'd come off worse in this conflict, both sides had suffered massive losses. The damage to their carriers halted the Japanese invasion at Port Moresby, and bought the Allies some much-needed time to repair and regroup. It wouldn't be the last major sea battle their forces would face in the coming weeks. Although Yamamoto's superior fleet Admiral Nagano had finally agreed to the attack on Midway, there were still disagreements between the Japanese naval commanders. Nagano had decided that Yamamoto should launch a separate mission at the same time as the Midway battle, to capture some sparsely inhabited volcanic islands, which extended over 1,000 miles west of the Alaskan Peninsula. The Aleutian Islands lay far to the north of Midway, and Yamamoto realized that the extra mission would extend his vast battle zone to unmanageable proportions, but Nagano would not be dissuaded. The Aleutian Islands appeared to have little economic, military or strategic value because of their barren mountainous terrain and harsh weather. But seizing them would further extend the defence of Japan and make it harder for ships to slip through the northern Pacific. There was also the hope that launching this second attack far from Midway might serve as a distraction, leading some American ships north and therefore weakening the US fleet. Meanwhile, far across the Pacific Ocean, the US Navy's Combat Intelligence Unit at Pearl Harbor had once again intercepted Japanese codes, and all Yamamoto's efforts at deception would be in vain. This also gave the US plenty of time to prepare, allowing them to turn Midway into a launching pad for their own attack into the heart of the Japanese fleet. Naval and air personnel were pulled from other commands, including forces from Pearl Harbor, as well as Fletcher's Task Force 17 from the Coral Sea. On top of these troop and equipment requisitions, Admiral Nimitz, who was in charge of the Allied defences, also requested the presence of renowned director John Ford and other photographers. They would go on to capture some of the most memorable footage of combat in the Pacific theatre. By May 30th, all US preparations were complete, and it was merely a matter of time before the Japanese attack force came within range. As the alarm rang out across Midway in the early hours of June the 4th, Nagumo ordered dive bombers, torpedo bombers and Zero fighters to launch their attack on the American base, and within less than 2 hours, the onslaught had begun. American planes, flown by Marine pilots, scrambled to intercept the attack and would destroy many of the enemy planes despite heavy losses. Meanwhile, as dive bombers from Nagumo's attack force swooped across the island, those defending the ground fought back fiercely. The anti-aircraft fire would prove much more deadly than the Japanese expected. Despite heavy damage to aircraft hangars and fuel storage depots, as the first wave of Imperial forces retreated, the Americans launched a counterattack, sending 2 torpedo squadrons heading straight for the Japanese carriers. Without fighter escorts, they were no match for the Japanese Zeros and were almost all shot down. But as the waves of American attacks continued, the Japanese were kept distracted. They were too busy focusing on the defense of their ships to launch a strike against the American fleet, and soon US planes had broken through Japanese defenses. The Enterprise Air Group hit 2 carriers, including Nagumo's, while Yorktown's bombers attacked a third. Before long, there was only 1 Japanese carrier still operational, and she counterattacked, sending a wave of dive bombers towards Yorktown. However, the Allied ship was far better prepared than her Japanese counterpart, and despite fires breaking out across the decks, they were controlled, and many of the enemy fighters were shot down. While a second wave of Japanese bombers headed for the American carrier, Rear Admiral Spruance launched a final strike on the Japanese fleet with 40 dive bombers. Within an hour, they found the last Japanese carrier. Despite several attempts to defend her, American planes delivered a deadly blow, which left her ablaze and sinking. As the smoke cleared and survivors were pulled from the water, it became clear that while Allied casualties registered in the hundreds, Imperial losses were in the thousands. Combined with the bulk of the Japanese carriers being eliminated, the Empire of the Rising Sun had suffered far worse. President Roosevelt himself congratulated those who had bravely fought off the enemy, clearly relieved that the American Navy had managed to deliver a decisive blow to their eastern enemies, checking their advance in the Pacific. While battles had been won on both sides, the war in this theatre was far from over.